Hi, I'm Bob Doyle, coming to you from my ITV studio where I'm webcasting lectures on information philosophy in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Information philosophy is the first new method of philosophizing since logical positivism and analytic language philosophy were created in the early 20th century. I'd like to argue that information philosophy is a systematic philosophy, which is a sort of technical term, but it suggests that the methods of information philosophy are applicable to all the fundamental questions about the nature of the universe and our place in it. It tries to be a metaphysical philosophy in an age when metaphysics is not very well regarded, but it also tries to answer a lot of other philosophical questions like the nature of the mind, of knowledge, values, free will, and so forth. So I've argued that in many ways information philosophy is therefore radically different from the philosophy taught in our universities today, which is based on ideas that have been taught for decades, but are questioned a great deal these days. There are many philosophers who have questioned their progress. We don't normally think about philosophy as progressing in the same way that science progresses, based on new experiments, based on new theories, and so forth. One might think that philosophy, being an inquiry into the nature of things, would occasionally make major progress in terms of understanding what are the great problems in philosophy. Again, at the turn of the last century, Bertrand Russell wrote a book called The Problems of Philosophy, which set out what seemed to him to be problems, and many of them went all the way back to the Greeks, to Aristotle, to Plato, questions like the nature of being, the origins of the universe were questions that Aristotle first raised. Even science was only beginning to come to grips with some of these problems, but Russell famously said that the problem with philosophy, not the problems of philosophy, but the basic problem with philosophy, was that once science tackled a problem that had been asked about by philosophers for centuries, should progress be made, he said, well, then that problem would be removed from philosophy and made part of natural science. And then he said philosophy would be the residue after it's lost a problem to the solution being offered by the sciences. Well, I have basically argued against the notion of Russell's residue on the behalf of those who teach philosophy, because I think they should be able to teach philosophical problems in their historical context, which much of philosophy is the teaching of the history of philosophy, and then they could go right on to explain how some input from science have changed our understanding of that problem, and we should be able to tell philosophy students that progress is possible and that philosophy is a more exciting, in a way, endeavor, can be as exciting as science if it's raised these questions in the first place. So I've basically made the argument that things should be done in terms of information because information is more fundamental than, for example, the language that we philosophize in, or some of the tools that are normally thought of as the tools we use in philosophy, like logic. Reasoning clearly and so forth are well taught in philosophy. However, they're also taught in the sciences, who think that we can reason in an orderly way, we can draw conclusions, we make predictions, of course, in science, and we get evidence. That's a big difference from philosophy. But the whole fundamentals of what we do can be thought of as something going on below language. After all, we have 2,000 languages in the world. All of them can be used to philosophize, but all languages raise questions of the ambiguity about the meanings of words. And I'm sorry to say that a great deal of what passes for philosophy in our universities around the world, but especially in those departments that have this English tradition of assuming that you can carefully define your concepts and therefore make progress in philosophy. You certainly can make progress in thinking more clearly, but for the most part, I find that philosophers who define new uses for terms that have had a use for some time, with the idea that by redefining the term, they have improved their ability to understand the problem, that to me has, for the most part, been a sad record in the 20th century. And it goes on today. We recently talked about how Dan Dennett, in working on the problem of free will and determinism, says there's no problem here. The idea of libertarian free will, which involves randomness, quantum randomness, alternative new possibilities from which we choose and so forth. He says, forget about that. That's magic, not just stage magic. That's real magic. That's a miracle. Well, I disagree. The problem of whether we can be creative and come up with a new idea never thought of before is clearly something I think science can help us to understand. So when Dan Dennett redefines free will as moral behavior, as moral competence, as moral responsibility, he argues that those who say we lack libertarian free will, this notion that we can somehow break the deterministic laws of nature, which Dan would like to argue really holds in the universe. Many people who agree with Dan that determinism is an adequate description of the universe and therefore applies to us, but he then, different from many other determinists who say, if we're determined, we lack moral competence, or we lack moral responsibility. We lack any responsibility if everything we do with our lives is somehow determined by prior causal events. And so to understand Dan's use of the definition, the redefinition of free will, and how he cleverly gets to a position that is a good position, but for the wrong reasons, Dan says that let's just define free will as moral responsibility, moral competence, and a moral agent is someone who has free will. To me, that is a wordplay, word juggling, Immanuel Kant called it, verbal subterfuge. And much of what goes on in philosophy is the redefining of words, and then the philosopher says in his or her book, I define it this way, and therefore I got something established that others don't know, and so forth. It's not a good way to philosophize, in my opinion. So what is it about language, though, that gives us a new word and therefore a new concept, and then we run out there and publicize it and get our books published and widely spread around the world and popularized in our magazines and so forth? What is it about that is the problem? And a large part of it, I see the problem, is the ambiguous use of words and how words can kind of take us off into thinking we've gotten to some new level of understanding. And my own work then is to say there's actually something much deeper than language, more metaphysical, more foundational than the words we use to think about problems in philosophy or even in science. A great deal of quantum mechanics was, according to Bohr and Heisenberg, a question of using the right language to describe the mysterious behaviors that they thought were happening. So why do I think information is more foundational? Because anything we are describing in the world, that's anything, we only are able to describe it in terms of information, which is a prelingual, pre-language state of the way the world is, the way we are, because the material world is made up of material objects. which are arranged in some way. And the way they are arranged is what I call information. I've said on many openings that the total amount of matter and energy in the universe today is exactly the same amount we had at the beginning of the universe 14 billion years ago. So what's happening? What's making all of the things we see going on around us, including this incredible life that we share with all the animals and all the cells and all the replicating molecules back to 3.5 billion years ago, before which there wasn't any life which is very special in the way it manages information to maintain itself and to maintain the flow of that matter and energy through us. And I think I'm trying hard to convince you that we should think of ourselves much less as the matter, as the material things that make up our bodies, even less, or even it isn't the cells, all the particular cells that are doing a wonderful job of keeping me alive. I hope for enough more years to get my work out there in the world, in my books, my lectures, and so forth. It's not the cells, it's not the biology. We are biological. We are biological animals. We are made of, our bodies are material, and they're assembled into the cells and so forth. And notice they are not assembled by anything but themselves. Biological organisms have this unique relationship to other things that are assembled by us, that they are self-assembled. Okay, this screen behind me was assembled in probably Malaysia somewhere by human beings. But those human beings are made up of themselves, which are made up of biological entities that are assembling and maintaining themselves and keeping us going. So that process of assembly involves information processing by all the cells, information communicating between the cells, information detection, perception in the environment by the cells, and then acting accordingly with their own little algorithmic methods, techniques of maintaining themselves. That's all well described by information, and although we write about it with words, today we diagram it and identify the chemical processes that are going on at the very tiniest levels. Recently we looked at some molecular machines which are well down inside the cell, way inside their mitochondria, for example, where all the energy is created, with little rotating machines that generate the ATP that goes to provide energy throughout our body. We're going to look a lot more at that because we now have animations of these things, these processes. I sometimes wish I had a better word than just processes, because these are absolutely miraculous, marvelous, incredible things going on to keep us alive. And the rate at which it goes on, in terms of my information notion, as opposed to saying it's astronomically fast, or large. No, it's biologically incredibly large. The information data rate, we classify our computers these days by how much information do they store in terabytes, and how fast are their processors, how fast is the information being processed. You know, it's terabits or gigabits or some per second. Our fastest CPUs can't generate new information or alter information as fast as our bodies do every day in toto over all the living parts of ourselves. So information philosophy needs matter to be embodied, because otherwise it's an abstract concept somewhere, and that's a question for metaphysics, which we will try to deal with. And information needs energy to be communicated, like this lecture coming to you over the internet. But that matter and energy total in the universe is just one total amount. Nevertheless, information is being created. It's not conserved like the conservation of matter and energy. Indeed, information is created, first when stars and galaxies formed, and in recent times when living things occurred on Earth. And there's absolutely no doubt that this information coming to you over the internet is adding to the total amount of knowledge in the world. And my story of thinking about it all, from the beginning of the universe up to the time of cosmological objects forming astronomical objects, up to living things trying to think about all of this, including the universe, that this whole thing is a story of information creation and information management and so forth. So my lecture today is taken from metaphysics in somewhat indirectly, but it's related at one very deep question in metaphysics, which is whether the universe allows for changes. And this chapter, being and becoming, it starts off at the top of the question, say that information philosophy greatly simplifies the classic dichotomy between being and becoming. And basically we're going to argue that being is something that concerns itself with abstract entities, and becoming is the essential nature of concrete material objects, which are always changing, at a minimum changing their positions relative to other objects. So my claim is that fixed amount of matter, but that matter is always rearranging itself. Initially, under nuclear forces, nuclear binding of the quarks into neutrons, protons, and nuclear particles, and ultimately the atomic combination of nuclear material and the electrons to form atoms, and then the rearrangement of atoms into assemblies called molecules, and then that molecules becoming quite elaborate, what are called macromolecules, which reassemble themselves, thousands and thousands of them in enormous long chains, including the ones that become the core molecules of biology. Molecular biology is nothing but enormous long molecules which can wind themselves up and turn themselves into little active things that can do work, that can build things, building themselves in the beginning. So what I'm saying is, it's becoming that we're focusing on metaphysically. What is it that's driving all of these changes around us, which account for everything interesting in our lives? Initially, it was simply the nuclear forces when they formed the matter as we know it, but then gravitational forces took over and pulled a lot of that material together. Initially, it was many hundreds of millions of years before gravity could overcome the heat, the energy of all the particles, which prevented them from easily coming together. And it came together when they began the galaxy formation over enormous scales of size in the universe. But gravity is one of those physical forces that can arrange matter. And when it arranges matter into something like a star, starting with a diffuse gas chaotically distributed in no obvious things that we would recognize as anything interesting, could we look at what was going on? But when the star forms, we get this beautiful spherical object. And when it gets close enough together to be banging all these particles against one another under the force of gravity, it heats up. And there was a long period in the universe from around the first 400 million years where if you were to look out, but there isn't anybody to look out, if you imagine yourself looking out at the universe, it would be totally dark in all directions. It wasn't until gravity could pull things together in stars and maybe things much, much larger than stars, might have been on their way to becoming a black hole very rapidly. It might have been a supernova-like star that formed and blew itself to bits in a very short time period. But if you lived in that time, it would be spectacular to look out at the dark in all directions, and then suddenly bright spots of light start appearing everywhere, and tremendous explosions, which, if we were in an arbitrary place in space, would be so distant they'd probably just look like lights popping on and going out. But some going on maybe 5 billion years ago, our own star formed, our own sun, and it started to give off light, without which nothing, for us in any case. Our planet formed and never got to be hot enough because it didn't have enough matter to heat itself up. Jupiter probably heated itself up quite a bit, but never got to be a star. To become a star, one has to be compressed so tightly that it starts off nuclear reactions, much like the one in the center of the hydrogen bomb. Hydrogen atoms, nuclei, are crushed so together that they form helium. And when they do so, they liberate energy. Here's an example where the mass, the matter, the material of two hydrogen atoms is a little bit, maybe 0.007% or some tiny little fraction, less than the sum of the matter of the two independent atoms. Let me just repeat that. Two atoms with a certain amount of mass, they form a new nuclear particle, helium, a new atom. And the mass it has is less than the sum of the two original masses. What happens to that missing mass? The answer is, Einstein said, E equals mc squared. That mass that disappears is converted into energy, first by multiplying it by the velocity of light squared. And that's a very large number. That gets up into the quintillions numbers that we're talking about, our particles and everything going on in our bodies. But that mc squared produces enough energy to keep the star radiating and keep it from any further collapsing. Remember, it wants to collapse under gravity. It heats up, it radiates the heat away, and for a long time, well into the late 19th century, astronomers thought, gee, why aren't these stars all cooled down? It looks like we have geological evidence of billions of years of things going on Earth, but it doesn't look as if you took a star, did the calculations, and found out how much energy there is in our sun from the gravitational collapse, it should have collapsed in millions of years, not billions of years. What's happening? The answer, they didn't know yet, but some speculated something's going on at the subatomic level. Indeed, it was these thermonuclear reactions, which quantum physics has completely explained today. But that gave the sun already 5 billion years of life, during which the last 3 or 3.5 billion, life was able to form and produce what we are today. So I'm hoping to tell a story to you that you can eventually feel you are comfortable with, that you see the origin of the universe coming down through these steps of forming the particles, the atoms, the molecules, the galaxies, stars, the planets, and then our sun, which for the last 5 billion years has been shining down on the Earth and giving us a supply of negative entropy, a technical term which I hope some of you will become comfortable with eventually, because it is mathematically equivalent to information. So we have an information flow coming to us from the sun in the form of what's called free energy, it can do work, available energy in the sunlight, on which everything living on Earth depends for its existence. Erwin Schrödinger, remember, said, life feeds on this negative entropy from the sun. And today I would just revise Schrödinger's thinking to say we feed on an information flow from the sun. And we are, living things, you and I, a kind of form, it's the information in our body that manages that flow of free energy from the sun, and material that we consume, that we digest to keep our material being replaced when cells die, and they do die at an enormous rate. They're all replaced. So our bodies, I see them as a form through which matter and energy are flowing, maintaining our overall form or our information. And I would like to just say, we are more our information than our matter. It's not our material selves that are important to us, it's our information. Because during my lifetime, all the cells in my body and all the molecules, all the atoms have been replaced many times. Some of them hundreds of thousands of times. Our red blood cells are dying off and get replaced in a matter of hours or days. Some cells, our brain cells, are said to be the neurons never being replaced, but the particles in them may be replaced. And these are questions we may get into someday. But I want you to think of ourselves as information, which is actively managing the material and the energy that we are also in a material sense. I feel much more kind of living to think of myself as the information that I've learned, that's in my mind, the knowledge I have, all my experiences are stored there, and they're all maintainable because of a flow of matter and energy, but the flow is being managed by the information, not what I know and learned in physics or biology, but by the rules and the algorithms, if you like, the little processes that all of the components of a living thing, right down to the cells, below the cells, right down to the little components, the organelles and everything in the cells, they're all running along on evolved programs of how to keep a cell alive, and we're dependent on all of them. But that's information all the way down. That's those little ATP synthase things that we're spinning a couple of lectures ago to generate our energy and send it all around the body. That's a little machine that we wish we human engineers could create, such a wonderful thing that keeps itself going, and if it dies, it replaces itself very quickly. Okay, so the lecture today is a deep question, whether everything I've just been describing to you is reducible to physics. In other words, is physics the kind of the most foundational science, most physical science, claims to describe everything that's happening at the level of our atoms, our elementary particles. So a great question emerges whether, given enough thought about physics, given enough study of how it does what it does, can we say that everything like life, mind, consciousness, knowledge are all reducible to physics? Or has there been a time in the history of life when there was no life before a certain time, and there was life after that time, and therefore we can say life emerges? Now, emergence is a controversial subject. Many books called Emergence or Reductionism and so forth. Emergence or reduction. Can we reduce biology to chemistry because we know we can reduce chemistry to physics? So are there enough rules in chemistry, which has some things going on that are not strictly physics, that's why it's a separate field, and when we get to biology, there are massively interesting things going on, and we can analyze them chemically to a great extent, and we're getting better and better at that all the time. Biochemistry, it's called. Is chemistry, biochemistry then enough for us to explain biology, or is there something else emerging? The idea that there were times when something didn't exist seems plainly obvious to me, so it's hard to understand why there's a big federal case, shall we say, about whether or not something came into existence. There are a lot of traditions and cultures where they think it's important for things to have come into existence, and they want their cultural theories, their cosmological theories, or their religious theories, or whatever, to get credit for these events. Others want to say, no, it's always been one thing going on, and it's been going on forever. We don't need to explain anything. And even those who recognize change sometimes say it's just illusion. That argument between the being thinkers like Parmenides and Plato and the becoming like Aristotle, Epicurus, and a few others who are more commonsensical to me and more biologists concerned with living things as something very special and different from what goes on at the materialist mechanical level. Aristotle in many ways is the first biologist and set up a lot of terminology and thinking about biology that remains with us today. But those who think something new is happening need to describe it. What I'm hoping I can do for us is to describe it in terms of the creation of information structures that are, in the case of life, and maybe we should go there, a time when everything prior to a certain time, called abiogenetic time, before there was before any life, was what happened in order to bring that life into existence, so-called origin of life. We have an Origin of Life initiative at Harvard, which is full of people working on very specific problems, all the way back to the very earliest things that formed that we would recognize as a kind of cell and well before. The reason I chose this lecture today, let me take a moment to tell you something about that. Let's see. I guess we need to send this page. There we go. Get my time back on the screen so I know where we are. We have almost a half an hour to go. I got an email yesterday from someone who's collaborating to put together a special issue of a major journal published by Elsevier on the issue of the physics of life, but in particular the physics of mind. So he said he's read information philosophy for years, and that's really very nice, and he's learned a great deal, and he would like me to write a 10,000-word article on the question of reducing the mind to physics. Can we reduce the mind? Are philosophers of mind or scientists of mind, neuroscientists, ready to say that they see how mind can be reduced to physics or not? And of course, I must have already written maybe 30,000, 40,000 words on this subject in preparation for a book in my Scandal series, the Free Will, the Scandal in Philosophy. I am also working on, after I'm done with Einstein, I will write a book called Mind, the Scandal in Psychology, because I'm very impressed with the fact that most of psychology in the 20th century said there was no mind. They were out of their minds. They'd lost their minds. I just have a lot of jokes about how could they take seriously that we don't have minds. But they did, and I'm going to work on that. So I've written a great deal, and the question I have is, should I take up an offer to put together a 10,000-word article in a few weeks? It's a January deadline. Well, I'm in a position to write those words because I've written a great deal of them. But I thought, okay, I'll take today and pick a subject, gather my thoughts on this question. Does life, does mind, does consciousness, does knowledge require thinking about something emerging that was not there before? And can my work in information philosophy identify these transitions between all of these things? So that's how I came to this subject today. I appreciate the chance to talk to you about it. When I mention the major transitions, I'd like to jump to a screen here that I have on the major transitions. This has been a subject, the work of a famous biologist named John Maynard Smith, who wrote a book on the origins of life, and he tried to identify, let's see if I've got my SL up here, and then I can come back here. Maynard Smith tried to identify what he called the major transitions, and so I thought I'd connect my lecture here today with the idea that there were identifiable transitions, before which something wasn't happening, after which something else was happening. Now, this is just particularly on life, but a lot of people look to these major transitions as something important to think about. Now let me just, I'd like to get one more page together. I'll do this and get this up on my other screen. He started with replicating molecules. And although I think I can just put my mouse over, You can't really see that. I'm apologizing for the fact that some of my screens are very flexible, but are not able to highlight the things I'd like to talk to you about. So bear with me for just a second, and I show you what I'm doing. I'm over here on another computer screen, and I did a search in Information Philosopher for my page on major transitions, and I click on it, and here we are. Now what I can do now, thanks to my mouse working, is I can pick out what Smith thought was the first important transition. And I agree with this completely. This is exactly the way we need to work. We need to recognize in information theory, and Smith is very familiar with this, so he doesn't stress it as much as I do, that replicating molecules are duplicating information every time they replicate. And that definitely is a way to describe the origin of life. We don't know exactly how it does it. There are a lot of theories that somehow a long, interesting molecule is sleeping, lying on some clay, which has a characteristic that there are grooves in the clay, and somehow that encourages like amino acids or the components of those early molecules that wanted to be made out of some things in the so-called soup of pre-life, and then they duplicate. And remember, Jacques Monod makes the same argument that we have a replication going on, and if it did nothing but replicate itself, make up huge crystal structures, which might have been beautiful in some simple way, and they might have had order in them, which is, in the sense, more information, but the information is all identical information over and over and over. That's order, but it's sort of free of kind of significance and meaning, the way living things are made up of lots of different replicating systems. What Monod said is, occasionally there are mistakes in the replicating. And when you get a mistake, it could be that that mistake now is better at replicating than the original without the mistake. That's the key step to understanding why we have a model like Darwinian evolution, where there's a variation, and then that variation is either better or worse. If it's better, it has better reproductive success. If it's worse, it dies off relative to others who are more successful reproducing. Notice the Darwinian theory is not survival of the fittest in the sense that the less fit die. The less fit don't die, they just don't reproduce as fast as the successful one. So it's the survival of the better reproducers, and a more gentle sort of picture than the tooth and claw vision, much of early Darwinian. So then he identifies some particular replicators, like the chromosomes. He then goes to RNA, which was the first molecule that we've seen can be both a gene and a protein, or an enzyme. A protein becomes active and functional and doing something in the body when it's called an enzyme. So he then goes on to bacterial cells, full cells, either the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes. Eukaryotes have independent nuclei and organelles, like the mitochondria, and our thinking about them today is quite interesting. There seems to have been an early time when the prokaryotic bacteria were doing their thing, and there were other forms of life. The archaea is a separate kind of single-cell organism. And the argument goes these days, a brilliant argument, that at one point the bacteria who tended to eat other bacteria occasionally, and also the archaea, may have taken one of these archaea and swallowed it whole, like in the Petit Prince, where the snake swallows the whole elephant or whatever. It became something that had inside of itself a very efficient generating machine for generating the energy needed for itself. And when the bacterium swallowed it, essentially in not digesting, but using it inside as a source of energy that was better than its own energy generation systems, whatever they were. Those, the argument goes, those little smaller organisms took over the job of generating energy for the new system. And we had a combination, a synergistic combination, in which the DNA of the bacterium, the larger bacterium, starts to forget the parts of the code it had which were needed to help it generate energy, and left the job to this sort of hired hand component that came in and took over the job. Well, those little incoming swallowed up objects became the mitochondria in our very sophisticated eukaryotic cells that we have today. And that's why it's correct for it's not mentioned in Smith's work, which was 20, 30 years ago, but then he distinguishes as major transitions going to cloning asexually, but then to other kinds of organisms. I see I'm missing a parenthesis on single-cell organisms, and then individuals that could either be just colonies that like ants and bees and termites, and there are other kinds of very interesting colonies, and then on out to the primates, okay? So this is a wonderful book by Marcello Barbieri called Code Biology, in which he identifies a lot of things that are kind of more interesting to me because he's concerned with the coding, with the signaling, and with the information structures that are going on. And unlike Smith, he goes on to first he gets macromolecules, ones that he thinks of as biological, pre-biological, but he then goes on up to the origin of mind, where he connects the codes that are in our cells to the codes that are in our neurons, and sensations by the neurons, and the active potentials, action potentials and their firings, which we talked about recently, I'm sure we'll come back to. And then the origin of language. And what Barbieri is saying, rather interesting thinker, is that there's one sort of process involving information exchange, communications with codes that he can map right up to what I'm doing with you now. That I'm basically emitting a sequence of codes, and you are decoding, and you're putting that back together as something you're learning from my lecture, and it's not completely unlike what's going on down at the cellular level, where the DNA is getting a report that we're missing a certain protein. The body is saying, where are those proteins? And the DNA creates a little messenger RNA, a message, which contains the code to make that missing protein, sends it out of the nucleus over to the cellular area that contains the ribosomes, which we've talked about and we'll talk about again many times. The ribosome takes in this messenger strip, and for every 3 code sequences from DNA, the codes among the A, G, C, T, a triple of those called a codon goes in and latches on to an amino acid that's being carried around with their own triple code from, they're called anticodon, and then it adds the right amino acid to build up the protein. That's our current understanding of what's going on, and I know it seems like a stretch that what I'm saying to you has got something to do with what's going on in our cells as we rebuild the new red blood cells, or the hemoglobin that goes into the red blood cells. But I see a great parallel. Marcello Barbieri doesn't put that much emphasis on this as an active information processing thing going on, but I think he would understand where I'm coming from, because information is very, very broad and applicable all the way back to the beginning of the universe. So what I did a few years ago was to imagine some information transitions. So these are the ones that I suggest. Let's see what I'm doing. Here's the topic today. And before I look at this thing I did a couple of years ago, which I haven't looked at since that time, so we'll see how much I can explain it to you. I just want to say, here we have the blog post. You remember I'm using my i5 blog, and every morning, this morning at 10 o'clock, I generated this title, and then I got a few words about reductionism and about emergence. and put them onto this page with some links. So you can go there, and I think I've got a link here on emergentists, for example. We could click on that and see what happens. Here is my web page on emergence. And I also have a web page on reduction. So let me just go back to my ATEM for a moment and take us over to my emergence page there. And I hope you'll read that. I've got a lot to say about this, more than I can fit in a single lecture. So let's go down to the bottom here and move this over. And I'm arguing that emergence has now become popular again because the complexity theorist from Santa Fe Institute, there's a very large group of scientists who think that they have come up with really deep answers that in a way escape from determinism, among other things. They think there's a chaos in the universe, there's a complexity in the universe which makes the future unpredictable. And one of the issues people have who are worried about us being completely determined by physical laws is that we have no freedom if there's this determinism, because everything's predictable to the Laplacian superintelligence who knows the positions of all the atoms and molecules. I hope you'll get familiar with that claim, which is still taught to undergraduates everywhere, and it's utter nonsense, really, now that we have quantum physics. But anyway, the complexity theorists tend to be centered around the Santa Fe Institute on complexity and chaos and so forth, who have generated hundreds and hundreds of books on why this makes the world unpredictable. They like the idea of the butterfly wings in Beijing affecting the weather in Minneapolis 2 weeks later, but totally unpredictable. Now, weather is unpredictable, but it's just because there's too much for us to put into our computers. In fact, when we tried to put it into our computers, the first fellow to do this found that if he changed just one digit near the end of his initial assumptions, the whole thing blew up, and we wound up in a completely different place. He invented, in that way, chaos theory, and there's a lot going on there, a lot to be said. But coming back to emergence, I just say this is a very old idea that things emerge. The people who think things emerge sometimes describe themselves in the area of life as vitalists. There are some forces at work, some holistic processes. So the emergentists think there are properties, perhaps even laws, at the upper levels of nature that are not reducible to the properties and laws of the lower levels. And reductionism, by contrast, argues that everything that can be explained by reducing to the basic laws of physics. Whoop, wrong switch there. So that's our question, and let me take me back to our, not clear where it is, how about over here? Let's go to John Maynard Smith again, and my page on major transitions. So you'll see what I would like to do is argue that I would like to add a lot more commentary on the right-hand side, but I basically start with the atoms first, then the galaxies and the stars and the planets. Those with negative entropy flows, information flows, like our sun. And these exhibit complex, what are called dissipative processes, which are far from equilibrium. This is the work of the Santa Fe Institute. Much of what they do comes down from a Belgian scientist named Elia Prigogine, and he argued that the processes he calls dissipative are ones I recognize as being far from equilibrium, and because they're far from equilibrium, they provide these flows, which I describe as coming through all the way through our bodies at the end of the day, the ones that are important to us. Okay, so then following Smith, some prebiotic molecules in that soup of largish molecules, maybe some fats, proteins, and all of these other things. Then membranes, those are his cells. The ribozymes are proteins that could become self-assembling, like RNA, then the DNA world, and then the organelles, the little things that are contained on their own, things like viruses, things like that swallowing up of a bacterium of a archaea and becoming our eukaryotes. Then I emphasize communications between, chemically, arguably, even these tiny semi-living or about to be living things or living things are able to communicate or have a kind of awareness, a proto-consciousness of what's going on around them in their environment. And it's just one sensation, more or less. It's the sensation we think of as taste, or maybe a little bit touch, because they probably have heat detection, they probably can detect chemical concentration, and that gives them a signal that says, it's nice and warm over there, and I think there's something I could eat. Or they might say, oh no, this area is toxic, I sense something that's harmful to me. They don't have our sensations, surely, they don't have our experience recording and so forth, but they are beginning to communicate. And that means they're sharing, exchanging information, and that's the basis of awareness. So then I want to describe this signaling information as being stored externally by multicellular organisms. And then not clear on the order of that, I might like to put neurons before that, because they're firing those action potentials, which Barbieri mentioned. And then the idea of a minimal proto-mind, because we have neurons. You remember from, I hope, yesterday's lecture, that Donald Hebb had told us that these complexes of neurons, when sensations come into our neocortex, they travel perhaps at random the first time they go anywhere, but as they go, the neurons that fire together somehow get wired together. And that's obviously correct. They're kind of assemblies of the neurons. They become assemblies. They become connected through their synapses out the dendrites to another synapse and so forth. They are neural networks, we call them these days, and they're formed at the beginning at random. Whatever our sensations are drive some of them, and they get connected, they get wired together. So my work in information philosophy, our model of the mind as an experience recorder, is to say that those neurons that have been wired together by Hebb's thinking is correct. But now that they are wired together, if in the future any signaling comes in, and it may only be visual signaling, or it may only be touch, or it may only be sound, if it fires some of that neural network that's been wired together, then I say neurons that were wired together in the past will now fire together, even if just some of them are newly fired. So the new firing comes in, and it fires those that are connected, wired together. And that then gives us a memory, gives us a, plays back, is my terminology, an experience recorder in the Hebb phase, then the experience reproducer in my phase, where I say just the touch of something going on in that complex of experience will get the whole experience to come back to mind. That's enough of a model for learning, for memory, and for any entity. An organism that had that level of complexity would now be able to count on or learn from its past experiences. And an organism that can learn from its past experiences is one that has a serious additional success at reproducing, at getting itself out of difficult situations and taking advantage of new things that come across it and allow it to be creative. I find that model very powerful and very emergent. It's quite clear that these things have to have been built by trial and error to the point where we have thinking beings. Okay, so that's the end of my transitions page, and let's take us back to our, it's so strange I can't find my pages sometimes, back to this page, so I want to do this. This is the topic of our page today. You remember I am using the blog as a way of putting up each lecture, and then at the end of the lecture, the topic of it, well, by the way, here's a page where I mentioned that I've created a page for Donald Hebb. We talked about him a lot yesterday. I took all of those books I had, I got some quotes from him, and I put them on a web page. And I'm not sure why this popped back to this page, but let's expand it a little bit more and go by the Hebb page. Here's our lecture on Donald Hebb yesterday, and if we're lucky, we come to the bottom, and sure enough, I've now posted that lecture here. So you can click on this YouTube and play back the lecture. So you can read a kind of abstract or summary of what the lectures are going to be about, and then the lecture as we delivered it. Now, this is a pretty nice way to make all my lectures available, right? With a little description and then a link to the lecture on epistemology. But I find that that's chronologically reverse order. So when you go in, you just see what I did yesterday, not 3 or 4 weeks ago. And so I've been working on that. One thing I've been trying to do is to see whether we can make a better version of what's on YouTube. Let me see if I can find my YouTube, and straight away, not there. Let's go here and take us to this page. YouTube is loading. Here's my YouTube page, and there we go. Here's our lecture on Donald Hebb yesterday. That's pretty nice. Looks like this one is what I'm doing right now. That's kind of nice. And a few others are showing, and there's a way to show more, but I just wonder, is this an adequate way for you to find my work, okay? And I've been thinking perhaps I could do better, and this is what I've come up with here. Here's the information philosopher page, and I'll shrink this just a little bit and show you what I've done. Let me go to the home page. Well, any page, every page has all my drop-down menus, of course. And now any page has got a link for my About I5 page, which I've shrunk to the word About, a link to my blog, which is the I5 blog. We were just driving that chronologically. A link to my books, a citation link that I built for you scholarly ones who would like to have an exact link in a standard APA form to go into your papers. The page on how much you might be able to help us, if some of you might be able to help do some of the make information philosopher stronger, and then a link to my lectures. So let's quickly look at this. So what I've done here is say, why don't I arrange the lectures in the order they were given? So the very first lecture on November 20th is right here, the 21st, 22nd, 5 in the first week, 5 in the second week, third week, fourth week. Here we are today, and I've even just put up the Reduction to Physics title, but you can't link here yet to see what is there. I'll do that in just a minute or two when the lecture ends. So I hope you enjoy this new way of organizing my lectures. YouTube and Facebook I find very difficult to find things. They're in reverse chronological order as well. I hope you'll find this one helpful going forward, and looks like we're running out of time, so let me just click this page, see if we get a little music in our background. I think we have it, but I can't hear it very well as I explained to you. I will now just go here, and that looks good, and bring up ATEM in the background with my lectures. Thank you for being here on our Metaphysics Thursday. Tomorrow I get back to Einstein, which is great because that means over the weekend I can write another chapter or two in my Einstein book. I'm very much looking forward to that. I've maybe bitten off a little more than I can chew with 5 lectures a week, but I'm very happy that I have a chance to go through the thousands of pages with their tens of thousands of links, incoming visits and so forth. Visits, not links. I'm very happy. Thank you very much, and see you